I begin this program today. I'm making this program several days after the start of the Hamas incursion into Israel, an event which has dominated the news over the last couple of days and which has been the center of world attention. And it is to this extremely important topic that I'm going to turn. But before I do, I would like to issue corrections and apologies for two errors that I have made in recent programs. The first is about my misnaming of the holiday, the Jewish holiday, upon which this incursion took place. I'd refer to the holiday as Yom Kippur. It is in fact Sukkot. I am sorry. I consider this, by the way, to be a serious and important error, and I must express my apologies to Jewish people, to people everywhere, for getting the name of this important holiday wrong. The second mistake is that I gave the date for the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. I got the date, the year of that destruction wrong. I said that it was in 79 AD. The destruction actually took place in 70 AD. Now, I consider this to be also a serious mistake, and on my part, an extremely embarrassing one, because I do consider myself to be fairly well versed in ancient history, the history of the Mediterranean world, from which, of course, I come, and I'm incredulous with myself for making this particular mistake. This is especially so given that the destruction of the temple by the Romans was, in my opinion, one of the most consequential events in world history. The world as we know it today was, to a great extent, shaped by it. 70 AD, the year when it happened, is therefore one of the most important years in world history, and it's absolutely one that I should know. Instead, I gave the date as 79 AD, which is, of course, the date of something completely different, the year when Vesuvius erupted and buried the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, a big event in itself, but hardly as consequential in terms of world history as the destruction of the temple. So, again, I have to express an apology and say I'm sorry and express my own embarrassment for that mistake and for my mistake in getting the name of the Jewish holiday wrong. It was Sukkot, as I said, not Yom Kippur. Anyway, I think the best thing to do, having made those apologies, is to now continue with the program and move on and discuss what is happening. And what is happening, my sense is, what is happening is that the fighting within Israel itself is perhaps starting to reduce, and we are now moving towards the next stage of this war, and war it is, which is the Israeli counter-action against Hamas in Gaza. Now, the Israeli authorities have been releasing casualty figures for the number of people who were killed. I have to say I've seen some rather inconsistent figures for this. I've seen one report which says that 200 Israeli citizens, many of them civilians, by the way, were killed over the course of this fighting. Others have put the figure much higher, at up to 1,000. And, of course, it is indisputably the case that hundreds of people have been injured. I'm not going to say what I think the numbers actually are. I'm not in any position to say. I am still trying to process the information from the ground. But one thing I have noticed is that the Israeli authorities are saying that around 1,500 Hamas fighters have been killed over the course of this fighting. Again, that is a number I am unable to corroborate, but if it is correct, then that gives us a sense of the intensity of the fighting and, by the way, of the scale of this operation. Now, I've seen other estimates, or perhaps I should more correctly say guesstimates, of the total size of the strike force that Hamas committed to this operation. And I've seen a number of 2,000 fighters being quoted, in which case, assuming that the Israeli figures are correct, then already something like 3/4 of this strike force have been killed. Now, I'm not saying again that that is true, but 2,000 fighters committed to this operation by Hamas shows, firstly, that it was a big operation, but to repeat again a point I have made in the past, it is nowhere near enough to threaten the existence of the State of Israel, and clearly that cannot have been the objective. The objective was firstly, clearly, to capture hostages, which apparently Hamas has done in the many hundreds, to spread fear and terror across Israel, and that Hamas has also achieved, to establish Hamas in the eyes of the Palestinian people as the force that is leading them in their resistance against Israel. And I suspect that some Palestinians at least have accepted that conception of Hamas, though I suspect that others are now greatly worried about the nature of the reaction from Israel which is to come, so that it could be that other Palestinians have some misgivings about this operation, but I don't pretend to be fully informed about Palestinian opinion about this operation at the moment, but also perhaps to establish Hamas once more as the symbol of Palestinian resistance within the larger Arab and Muslim world. And I am sure that Hamas has also had a further objective, which is to engage Israel in some kind of long battle. And I cannot shake off the concern, the real fear, that the Israeli reaction is consistent with the plan that Hamas has had. Now, I say this because there have been many statements from Israel, from Prime Minister Netanyahu and other officials. I discussed yesterday as if it looked to me as if Israel was preparing to advance into Gaza itself. Apparently a force of around 100,000 Israeli troops is being assembled, many of these troops being, of course, reservists. I don't know that that is correct. I've heard that Hamas has around 40,000 fighters at its disposal within Gaza. And again, I have absolutely no way of verifying whether that number is correct or not. But if there is a Hamas force of that size in Gaza, and if these fighters are as motivated and as disciplined, or at least proportionately motivated and disciplined, as perhaps the elite unit that was sent to carry out that strike deep into Israel, the 2,000 men who Hamas sent on this attack in Israel. If that is the case, if there are as many as 40,000 fighters in Gaza, then it does seem to me as if Israel has a long battle on its hands. It's been suggested, and I've seen Russian commentaries to this effect, that a fight on that scale could continue for months. And of course, in that case, Israeli casualties could be very high, with urban warfare in this kind of setting being extremely difficult. And it seems to me that there has to be at least a real possibility that this is exactly the kind of battle that Hamas has been seeking to provoke. Some discussions about alternative options for Israel are appearing across the internet and are apparently being discussed in Israel itself. There have been comments in Israel about the Israelis turning the city of Gaza into ruins. There have been demands or warnings or calls upon the population of Gaza to leave the city. It's not at all clear to me where they're supposed to go, whether they're supposed to go to Egypt or some other such place. That doesn't seem to me to be at all clear what the plan there is. And I wonder what the Egyptian authorities would think about it if the plan is indeed that they should go to Egypt. But anyway, there's been that demand. There's already been a cut-off of electricity and water supplies to Gaza, which would, of course, must be doing real injury to the civilian population of the city. But I can't imagine that it is doing proportionate harm to the Hamas organization and its fighters. They presumably have been stockpiling equipment and ammunition and supplies in their various tunnels and bunkers and other things that supposedly they've established in Gaza. Everything about this operation looks to me as if it has been meticulously prepared, and I can't imagine that Hamas, with all the indications of careful planning that it has done, would not have prepared for something like that. So I have to say that an advance by the Israeli army into Gaza seems to me to carry with it considerable risk, military risk. And I would also add that the alternatives that have been talked about, razing Gaza to the ground, turning the city into ruins, driving out the civilian population. Well, doing those things would, I think, I'm confident, amount to war crimes. And I can't help but think that from a political perspective, they would be deeply damaging to Israel. In fact, I'm going to say straight away that my own experience, my own knowledge of war, is that perpetrating war crimes, never assists in achieving political objectives. On the contrary, it undermines and negates whatever those objectives might be. So, putting aside moral considerations, which, by the way, we should never do, it seems to me that these draconian responses that some people have been talking about, they would be a massive political mistake if it is indeed the plan or the intention to act upon them, which I sincerely and fervently hope it isn't. So that's what I want to say about this. As I said, I am not sure what the Israeli response is. I would say that in war, more than in almost any other field of human endeavour, it is important always to make careful, calculated decisions, to exercise the greatest amount of discipline, not to fall for provocations, not to be tempted into extreme acts which ultimately are self-defeating, both in a moral sense and in a political sense. And I hope that the Israeli government and the Israeli authorities understand that. I would point out that in the war in Ukraine, the Russians have understood this. The Russians have certainly, as far as I can see, made efforts to restrain themselves, not to fall for provocations. There have been constant demands from various people who support the Russians or within Russia itself, for the Russians to take extreme steps in response to what is seen as Ukrainian provocations, the shelling of Donetsk city, the attacks on journalists in Russia, the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, all of those kind of things. President Putin himself has spoken out against this thing. He's come in for some degree of criticism because of his restraint and the restraint that the Russian leadership has shown in the face of these provocations. I think the course of events in the conflict in Ukraine is increasingly showing that self-discipline and self-restraint that the Russian authorities have shown up to now was correct and justified and is bearing for the Russians beneficial political results. I think if the Israelis, on the contrary, allow themselves to be goaded into actions which are wrong, by contrast, inevitably, they will pay a severe price for this. So anyway, we are all waiting to see now what the Israelis are going to do. Now, fighting, as I said, continues, and I don't want to get into details about the fighting, which is difficult to assess. But as I said, I do come to my own view, which is perhaps that the worst of the fighting within Israel itself is probably now behind us. And I will say a number of things about this military operation. Firstly, there continues to be a great deal of discussion about why the Israelis were caught so completely by surprise. And there's been much commentary about the fact that the Israeli intelligence failed there's been questions about this. Scott Ritter, a US intelligence officer who has worked closely with Israeli intelligence in the past, including during the time period when he was himself a UN weapons inspector in Iraq. He's spoken about how Israeli intelligence, the Israeli intelligence community, gradually lost its way, adopting American methods which were less good than those which Israel itself had developed following the intelligence debacle of the 1973 war. And he's spoken about a general decline and even atrophy on the part of the Israeli intelligence community, which I think is consistent with this. And I've already expressed my own view that there's been a general sense of complacency in Israel, both on the part of the intelligence community there and on the part of the political leadership. And it remains my own view that that is probably the explanation for this. And I've also had some people contact me and they pointed out that Sukkot is apparently a sort of often exuberant festival. One of the targets of Hamas's attack, a particularly grisly event, was apparently a rave party where people were killed, revelers were killed by Hamas fighters. Apparently there's videos of this. I have to say straight away that I haven't seen these videos myself and don't particularly want to see them. But anyway, the point that I want to make here is that it's been pointed out that there was a lot of partying on the occasion of the end of this holiday. Apparently it's a harvest holiday, or it originally was, and that perhaps this meant that many people who ought to have been observing events and keeping an eye on what was happening, well, many of them were probably asleep or anyway in no condition to keep track of what was happening. Well, I've no doubt that that is true, and I've no doubt that that was why Hamas chose that moment to launch its strike. But I will say that a well-organized, professional intelligence community, such as the one that Israel would once had, would presumably have been alert to this and would have prepared for the fact that the other side might take advantage of a holiday, as of course happened at the time of the 1973 October War. And if the Israelis were taken by surprise because of a holiday, then that, to my mind, simply reinforces Scott Ritter's point about an atrophy within the intelligence community in Israel. It doesn't in any way obviate this. And it seems that there were also warnings from the Egyptian government that some kind of big event by Hamas might have been planned, and that they warned the Israelis about this, but that the Israelis didn't heed that warning. And again, there's been lots of discussion about this, which I'll turn to in a moment. But I would say that if that warning was indeed ignored, then it is a sign, again, that people in Israel, the people who mattered, the intelligence communities, the political class, those kind of people, really were complacent or were not up to their job or were asleep on the wheel, because a warning like that coming from Egypt certainly should have been taken extremely seriously. Egypt was in control of Gaza up to the 1967 Six-Day War. That is, of course, after the British pulled out of this area around the time of Israel's founding. And, of course, the Egyptians therefore have a close connection to Gaza. And, of course, the Gaza area borders with Egypt. And beyond that, there's been a historic connection, apparently a ideological connection between Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. The present government of Egypt is deeply hostile to the Muslim Brotherhood. It came to power as a result of a military coup against the president, the civilian president of Egypt, President Morsi, who was, of course, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the present government of Egypt is hostile to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is essentially an Egyptian political and religious movement. It would be likely to be keeping close track and monitoring upon what sympathizers and supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt might be saying to each other. It is not implausible that Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers in Egypt might have been in touch with people from Hamas in Gaza, and it's not difficult to see, at least not difficult at all for me to see, how news of some kind of big attack by Hamas might have leaked through to Egypt and been relayed by the Egyptian government to Israel, with the warning being disregarded. So, clearly a major failure. Now, of course, there are lots of speculations, lots of rumours, lots of discussion that this was somehow a designed event, that the United States government, that the Israeli government either instigated it themselves or allowed it to happen because they see it as a way of pursuing their own political objectives. In the case of the United States, to take the focus away perhaps from the conflict in in Ukraine. In the case of both Israel and the United States, to pursue their further policies in the Middle East. All I would say about that is that I have seen no real evidence of this myself. Nothing has happened that, to my mind, cannot be explained by incompetence of the kind that Scott Ritter is talking about, and complacency and of political leaders in Israel especially, but also in the United States, becoming absorbed with their internal problems. But if I am wrong about this, then all I would say is that that would be an act of almost unbelievable cynicism to me, deliberately engineering an event like this. And not only would that be an astonishing crime, but it would also be a disastrous political mistake, spreading violence and chaos into Israel itself, creating more violence and potentially chaos in the Middle East, if there's been a clear lesson from the last 30 years, it is that the United States, neither Israel nor the United States, can ride the tiger of this chaos in the Middle East, far from its outcome being to their advantage. Always it has ended up engendering failure. So, as I said, I have not yet seen strong evidence that would persuade me that this was planned in the way that people think. One should be careful also before reaching conclusions that deny Hamas agency. Hamas, it strikes me, is a ruthless but extremely calculating organization, and one that is certainly capable of making its own decisions. But anyway, I've not seen evidence that would persuade me that, as I said, this was engineered in that kind of way. And for the moment, I'm going to stick with the theory of incompetence and complacency to explain these events. But of course, if I am wrong, and that possibility obviously exists, then I come back to what I said. The cynicism that would lie behind something like that would be absolutely breathtaking. It would be astonishing, even in the context of all that has been happening over the last couple of decades. It would be something that would arguably surpass all of that. Anyway, I just wanted to finish this discussion today as we wait anxiously to see what Israel is going to do, with two further points. The first, and it's been made to me now by several people who have experience and knowledge of these matters, is about the extraordinary proficiency with which Hamas has executed this operation. Not only its ability to keep this thing secret, to carry out an operation of this kind without Israel or the United States apparently knowing about it in advance. Such a contrast, by the way, to Ukraine's offensive, which everybody is talking about months before it happened. But anyway, put that aside. But also the proficiency with which the Hamas fighters, for all their ruthlessness, acted over the course of this operation. And I've had several people who know about these things saying to me that this is more consistent with the kind of thing one would expect from highly trained special forces troops, certainly not insurgents, the usual insurgents, and that does speak of an enormous advance in Hamas's technical proficiencies and skills. And of course, it's likely that the fighters who carried out this attack, some of whom, if the Israeli claims that 3/4 of them have been killed are true, would have been on a one-way suicide mission. I'm just saying. But anyway, it suggests that these fighters were not only highly trained and highly prepared for this operation, but that they were clearly an elite force within Hamas. But of course, if Hamas has been able to generate such an elite force, then one must wonder about the proficiency of the 40,000 Hamas fighters who are still there in Gaza, and that might suggest that it would be most unwise for Israel to underestimate them. Now, that's one thing. The second point that's also been made is about the quality of the weapons that some of these Hamas fighters were using. There's been a great deal of discussion and speculation about whether they might have received some of these weapons from Ukraine. There is now, I have to say, some evidence that they did, though again, I can't really discuss the scale of that. But in addition, it's clear that they had a very substantial amount of equipment that they've been able to use and use effectively, and some of it might not have been sourced from Ukraine. For example, I've had one person who's very familiar with these matters describing to me how important it is that Hamas fighters have been able to knock out Israeli Merkava tanks. These tanks were designed in a particular way to make them impervious to attack by simple RPG-type anti-tank grenade launchers, and yet the Hamas fighters were able to destroy them, apparently using launchers of precisely that kind, and that must imply that Hamas has developed or has acquired shaped charge warheads for those launchers. And that is an important development, and it's likely that Hamas has had assistance from third parties to do that, and that's something I'm going to be discussing in a moment. My key point is simply this. We've seen that Hamas fighters are, some of them at least, are highly trained, highly motivated, well organised, that Hamas is able to plan and carry out a complex operation. We've seen also that Hamas has increasing technical proficiency with its weapons, and we're told that there are tens of thousands of Hamas troops in Gaza. Now, it might be the case that Hamas has shot its bolt, that its best fighters, its best equipped fighters have all been used up in this attack. But if the situation is different, if Israel, with its 100,000 men, is going to be taking on a well-organised and well-trained and well-equipped army in a densely populated urban environment like Gaza, then I can easily see how this thing could drag on for weeks and months, how Israeli losses could grow, how indeed the long war that Prime Minister Netanyahu is talking about might actually come about. Now, it seems to me that Israel, which, in spite of everything that's been said about it, is still a small country, is not in a condition, is not in any kind of position to fight that sort of long, debilitating war. And if instead it tries to short-circuit the problem by taking the kind of draconian actions that I spoke about, by launching some kind of attempt to turn Gaza into ruins, then, as I said, the political problems there are simply going to get greater. It seems to me, and I repeat it again, and this is the last moment I'm going to say this, better altogether to look for more sustained, more practical solutions, talk perhaps to the Egyptian authorities, talk to the United States, carry out a major reform of the Israeli intelligence system, look at the political problems within Israel itself, tighten up control of the Israeli army, take steps as well over time to perhaps weaken the grip of Hamas on Palestine, on Gaza. It could be that that might involve, in fact, I would say that it definitely would involve some kind of resumption of the political process to resolve the long-standing problems in the Palestinian territories, and also to take further steps to ease the economic situation in Gaza, which might give people there a long-term stake in achieving some kind of stability in their lives rather than seek conflict with Israel beyond this. And ultimately, if Israel can learn to coexist with the Palestinian people, can find some means to achieve a mutual respect with them, and of course, respect is always important in human relationships and in relationships between states and nations, but perhaps especially so in the Middle East. Well, that would be, of course, the optimal outcome of all. But anyway, that's what I want to say. I wanted to say that decisions, as I said, made in anger are repented at leisure. It's best, it's most important at this point in time to think hard and think through before any action is taken, which might ultimately backfire and be action which Israel comes to regret. Now, I've expressed my views clearly. I know that there will be many people who won't agree. We will see how things turn out. It may, of course, be the case that the Israeli authorities have a better understanding of the situation in Gaza than I do. It may be that Hamas is a weaker organization than it actually appears to be. We shall see. But anyway, I've stated my view. I think it's only right that I should, and that is the view I have given. Now, one thing I would say is that there does seem to be a pushback against attempts to try to expand the war by involving Iran. That particular catastrophe, it seems there is resistance against. There's been an article in Politico which says that there is no evidence or proof Israel and the United States uncertain of Iran linked to Hamas attack. And we hear that after the violence erupted in Israel, some were quick to point fingers at one of the Palestinian militant group's long-standing allies. And Politico goes on to say US and Israeli officials say they remain unsure whether Iran was definitively involved in Hamas's surprise weekend attack on Israel, which has spiraled into one of the region's worst spells of violence in decades. And the article continues along those lines. Now, I spoke about the extraordinary improvement in training, in organization, in military proficiency on the part of Hamas. I spoke about how their equipment seems to be much better than it was. It's been pointed out that, yes, there is an industrial base in Gaza, but that hardly explains the extent of this improvement. I'm perfectly willing to believe, in fact, I think it is almost certainly the case, that a lot of this enhancement in Hamas's proficiency has arisen because of the movement's support by Iran. No doubt there have been Iranian instructors sent to Gaza. No doubt Hamas fighters have found their way to Iran, and quite possibly they've been trained there. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but if so, it wouldn't surprise me. No doubt, or quite plausibly, Iran has provided weapons and perhaps explosive charges and training in the use of these weapons, and maybe even set up some kind of facilities in Gaza in order to enhance Hamas's military capabilities. Or perhaps, if not Iran directly, some of Iran's allies, like, say, the Hezbollah movement in Lebanon, has done all that, though presumably in that case with Iran's blessing. But none of this necessarily proves that Iran was behind this attack at this time. And clearly, there is no definitive proof of this. Iran has categorically denied it. And even if it is the case that in this very complicated political structure that exists in Tehran, there might have been some factions or some parts of the government that were involved at this point in time, expanding the war to involve Iran, would, in my opinion, be a catastrophic mistake and would end up making the situation in the Middle East far worse. There's all these siren voices in the West, in Britain, and even more in the United States, calling for some kind of retaliation against Iran. All I would say is that at this particular point in time, that will be pouring petrol on the flames, given what a potentially powerful country Iran is, given the fact that Iran is now becoming a member of the BRICS and has strong relations with China and Russia. I think this would be the most disastrous mistake that could possibly be made. So I hope that this isn't done, and I hope that this position that we've seen in Politico, I suspect this article we've seen in Politico, I think this information from Israel and from the United States has been rushed out by concerned officials who understand the dangers and want to try to prevent an attack upon Iran, very much for the reasons I have said. I hope that this line sticks and that, in fact, we don't get that attack on Iran, that those siren voices are not heeded, and that instead Israel again, and this time its Western supporters, especially in the United States, take a deep breath, think through what they're going to do, and act only after they've thought out these problems and got a true sense of what is happening, and calibrate their response to the actual needs of the situation at this time. Well, that is my view about the situation in the Middle East. I'm going to say that I found this a particularly difficult story to cover. I've seen some absolutely horrifying images about what is happening, of what has happened over the course of this attack in Israel. I understand that there are very strong emotions on both sides. I understand that many people, not just Palestinians, but people sympathetic to Palestine, have intense feelings about the treatment Palestinians have received for many decades. All I would say about that is that I understand those feelings, but that doesn't justify some of the actions that I have seen made. I don't think that they in any way advance the true political objectives of seeking a resolution, a just resolution of this long-standing conflict. On the contrary, I think that they can only make the situation worse for Israelis, of course, but worse for Palestinians also. And as I said, I hope counsels of restraint and reason and diplomacy prevail, but I say that with little hope that they will, and with deep foreboding about what is coming. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this situation in Israel and in the Palestinian territories today. Now, of course, there are other players involved in this affair, and one of them is Russia. And I discussed yesterday that we've already seen the first article appearing in Britain about how President Putin or the Russians have in some way, as part of a Russia-Iran axis, orchestrated this thing. This grotesque article by Colonel Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph. No evidence to support that claim provided at all. Nothing of that kind. But anyway, we have now had an actual comments about this crisis from no less a person than President Putin of Russia, and it has come, very interestingly, over the course of negotiations between the Russians and the Iraqis. The Prime Minister of Iraq is now Prime Minister Mohammed Soudani is in Russia, and he has in fact been received by President Putin in the Kremlin, and the Kremlin has provided an overview, a number of comments. President Putin has provided a number of comments about what is happening in the Middle East at this time. And I will just pass on some of the things that Prime Minister Putin has said. And he says that he said to Prime Minister Soudani, "Your visit to Russia is taking place against the backdrop of crises. The Ukrainian crisis continues, and unfortunately we see a sharp worsening of the situation in the Middle East." I think that many will agree with me that this is a clear example of the failure of the policy of the United States in the Middle East, which tried to monopolize the settlement, and he means the settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but unfortunately was not concerned with finding compromises acceptable to both sides, but on the contrary, put forward their own ideas about how this settlement should be achieved by putting pressure on both sides, first on one, then on the other. But each time without taking into account the fundamental interests of the Palestinian people, bearing in mind, first of all, the need to implement the decisions of the UN Security Council on the need to create an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. So those are interesting words from Putin. He's putting the blame for this crisis ultimately on the United States. He said that the United States has never acted as a proper mediator or broker. It's tried to marginalize other parties, prevent them from participating in the negotiations. The Russians, by the way, have bitter memories about this because, of course, back in the 1970s, when, of course, it was the Soviet Union and the United States, there was a brief moment when the Soviets and the Americans seemed to be working together alongside each other to seek a peace settlement of the conflict in the Middle East. I can remember that after the 1973 war, there was an agreement that there would be a peace conference in Geneva. All of the Arab states and the Palestinians were to be represented. Israel, of course, was to participate as well. And the Soviet Union and the United States were to act as joint chairs. And that was a peace conference. It met once, as I remember, and then it broke up and it never met again. And the United States quickly lost interest in it as they started to seek a settlement brokered and negotiated exclusively by themselves without the involvement of the Russians, or at least the Soviets, as it was at that time. And this despite the fact that in 1977, President Carter of the United States and his administration, they made one last bid, as I remember, to reverse this process, this drift away from the Geneva peace process, which, as I said, involved the Soviets. And there was supposed to be, or at least there was actually, a joint statement agreed by the United States and Russian governments, which again seemed to chart a joint approach to the resolution of the conflict in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab states. And again, that fell by the wayside. The United States, in the end, turned its back on it and went its own way and sought instead to isolate and marginalize the Soviets, the Russians, in the Middle East and exclude them from the peace process. And the result, exactly as Putin says, is that decades of American diplomacy, ever since, have failed completely to achieve a successful resolution of this problem. There have been unilateral agreements between Israel and some of the Arab states, starting with Egypt and then Jordan, and then moving on to include some of the Gulf Arab states. But the heart of the problem, which is in the territory of the former British Mandate of Palestine, this issue, this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, that has never really been properly addressed, and it has festered ever since, resulting in the problems that we see now. Now, whether the Russians would have been able to bring a different approach to bear, and whether they would have had greater success, who knows? But it's difficult to see that they would have failed more completely than the Americans have done. And again, what Putin says is that the American approach has been to pressurize the sides towards accepting solutions which are more in keeping with the American perception of the problems in the region, as opposed to the genuine interests of the people who live there. It's difficult, as it's difficult to argue with the force of that. Now, one further point perhaps can be made in light of Putin's words, which is that it may be, if one reads his words carefully, if one thinks carefully about what Putin is saying, that he is starting to say that the time when the United States should be left alone to monopolize peace efforts in the Middle East must now end. It is time for other parties to start to become involved. One of them, of course, presumably would be Russia, perhaps other countries, China specifically, principally, perhaps India as well. Perhaps they can all start to take a role in this process, because American diplomacy in the Middle East has brought the region to a complete dead end. Anyway, what will happen there, what they will do, all that, of course, remains to be seen. Now, of course, over the course of this visit by the Prime Minister of Iraq, President Putin also, as we saw, mentioned the Ukrainian crisis. And of course, that continues just as before. And now we're getting increasing amount of information that the Russians are indeed on the offensive. That in effect, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has run its course, and that it is the Russians now who are attacking. And earlier today, it started to look as if the major Russian offensive is not happening in the Kupiansk area, but in Avdeyevka, this small town near Donetsk. And this is, of course, the town where Ukraine has been concentrating the greater part of its forces near Donetsk, where it's conducted the shelling against Donetsk city. And apparently, there's been a massive Russian artillery strike on Ukrainian positions there. And by some accounts, something like 20,000 Russian troops are now participating in some sort of offensive in the Avdeyevka area with the intention of surrounding the town and trapping whatever Ukrainian troops are there. Now, if this is all true, and we've had many reports about similar attacks in the past, but if this is true, then this is a very major event indeed. It would suggest that along with the pressure in the north, and there's been more reports, by the way, that the Russians are reactivating their forces in the north, in the Kupiansk and Oskol river line. Anyway, it would suggest that the Russians are now taking steps, the first steps, to tighten their grip around the various salients that the Ukrainians now find themselves holding. They're essentially in a salient east of the Oskol River, surrounded increasingly on multiple sides by the Russians. I saw a report yesterday which said that the major Russian objectives in the fighting around Kupiansk and in the Oskol River is not to storm Kupiansk, but to envelop the Ukrainian forces there, east of the Oskol River, to create a cauldron with the Oskol River at the back of these forces, trapping them there, and perhaps forcing their surrender or perhaps destruction. It could be that the same is what the Russians are doing in Avdeyevka, and it might be that eventually the Russians get round to doing the same thing in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area on the Zaporozhye front lines, where the Ukrainians are already surrounded, in effect, on three sides, and where the Russians now seem to be increasingly counterattacking. Now, all of that if that's indeed the Russian plan, suggests that the Russians, in terms of the Ukrainian war, are now essentially focused still on attrition, on wearing down the Ukrainian forces, breaking the Ukrainian army, surrounding and defeating isolated groups of the Ukrainian forces, eventually, no doubt, pushing towards the Dnieper River, preparatory to the big offensive, which the Russians will presumably launch sometime in 2024. But we see that the Russians, at least, are not only taking back the initiative on the front lines in Ukraine, but they're now starting to think and act more ambitiously, and that they're now pushing Ukraine, the Ukrainian forces, not just in one place, in Kupiansk and in the north, but that they're starting to take more offensive measures elsewhere as they steadily increase the pressure on the front lines, right across the front lines. And I don't think that Ukraine has a valid response to this. The word is that in Washington, the Biden administration is now thinking of trying to provide funding for Ukraine by attaching funding for Ukraine to a package of additional funding for Israel to meet Israel's needs in advance of this fighting that no doubt will soon happen in Gaza. I don't think that's actually a workable idea myself. I think it will leave open, it will open up the administration, it will to even further demands that it is prioritizing Ukraine over Israel, the United States' long-standing ally. I think there will be actually more criticism in Congress of this idea than otherwise, and I can even see how some Democrats, especially in the House, well, I can imagine that some of them who, to say it frankly, don't seem to like Israel very much, it might conceivably even turn some of them against the whole package, including the Ukrainian part of it. So I don't think this is going to work. But putting that aside, it doesn't address the underlying problem, which is that Ukraine is running out of men and machines and shells. It can't be strong all across the line at every single point. Everywhere now, the Russians are steadily and gradually increasing the pressure, and we're seeing that they're now doing that in Avdeyevka. And of course, the Ukrainians can try to redeploy more reserves to plug the gaps in the front line, or they can try to move troops from one place to another. But they've already lost significant ground in the area of the Vremivka salient. The Russians are pushing hard towards the Oskol River and Kupiansk. If the gaps are plugged by Ukraine redeploying forces and reserves, then other weak points, other breaches in the Ukrainian lines will simply appear in their place, and with the Russians now having the initiative and feeding reinforcements onto the front lines, they're in an increasingly strong position to take advantage. So again, we see that even as the crisis in the Middle East deepens, the Russians continue methodically, incrementally, but successfully to take advantage of the situation in Ukraine and to increase their pressure there and to move purposefully towards their eventual victory in the war. Now, in the meantime, even as President Putin is meeting with the Prime Minister of Iraq, he's had detailed discussions with leaders from Central Asia. The President of Kazakhstan, President Tokayev, has been in Moscow. Putin has also had meetings with President Mirziyoyev, the President of Uzbekistan. There's increasing talk about industrial and cooperation. Somewhat astonishingly, Russia has been making up for energy shortfalls in Central Asia by redirecting gas and oil to Central Asia, something that's never happened before. There's been much talk about the Central Asian states actually loosening their ties with Moscow. I don't myself see any sign of that. Economically, on the contrary, it seems to me that the Central Asian states and the Russians are actually integrating more closely with each other. And I think that this process will continue and will intensify, and it is consequential. It will strengthen Russian positions in Central Asia, and of course, a Russian victory in Ukraine will accelerate that process even further, weakening still further the image of the United States as a viable alternative for the Central Asian states to look to, and of course, to the European Union as well. So we see how in these crises, in the crisis in the Middle East, President Putin watches and waits. He's hinting at a possible Russian, or perhaps Chinese and Russian, or perhaps Chinese and Russian and Indian, or BRICS alternative to American diplomacy in the region. He sees the disaster there. He says it's time that others, apart from the Americans, came in and sorted out the mess. In the meantime, he's also sensing that in Ukraine, things are working out increasingly to his advantage. And of course, in Russia's backyard, in Central Asia, his grip, Russia's grip, is starting to tighten. Well, interesting times, complicated, fraught and difficult times. We shall see what happens in the Middle East over the next few weeks. I think difficult and important decisions have to be made. I have to say frankly, I have little confidence in the judgment of the people who will make them. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his team, President Biden and his team in Washington. I have little confidence that these people will make the correct choices, though I'm quite clear what those correct choices are, and even more clear what the wrong choices would be. And in Ukraine, I think the direction of travel in the conflict, in the war, is becoming clearer as well. And of course, President Putin and the Russians, as I said, they watch and they wait and they make their preparations. And no doubt, quite plausibly, they're saying to themselves in Moscow that everything comes to him who waits and who doesn't let themselves get panicked and thrown off course. Well, that's where I finish my video today. We will see, as I said, how these events in the Middle East turn out. And of course, the conflict in Ukraine goes on, and we will see what happens there too. Anyway, that is the end of my program for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Just to remind you again, all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X, the former Twitter. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there are magic mugs and hats and hoodies and t-shirts and all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.